I'm going to read an excerpt from a different book about the Great Depression. This one is entitled "The Forgotten Man" by Amity Shlaes. It's a conservative take on the Great Depression. In the section I'm about to read, I'm going to describe what the economic situation was before the election of Roosevelt, when Hoover was still in power. One late summer day in 1931 in Salt Lake City, the money ran out. Not just the money in the banks, and not just the money in town coffers, the money that citizens had to spend. Locals reached into their pockets and, finding nothing, began to trade work and objects. Barbers traded shaves and haircuts for onions and Idaho potatoes. From there, the trading spread to other products. Life in Utah had always been a desert when it came to water. Now it was a desert when it came to money as well. People in Utah knew how to survive a desert. Maybe they could find a way to manage in the money desert as well. A short drive north in Ogden, a banker instructed the employees of several family banks in the art of bluffing. The Ogden State Bank had closed its doors. His bank would not go down the way it or Bank of the United States had if he could help it. Quote, "If you want to keep this bank open, you must do your part," the banker told his staff. "Go about your business as though nothing unusual was happening. Smile, be pleasant, talk about the weather, show no signs of panic. Pay out in fives and singles and count slowly." The man's name was Mariner Stoddard Eccles, and the next week he would turn 41. He was a leader in his community, the firstborn from the second marriage of a wealthy Mormon patriarch. He had pushed hard to ensure that a company connected with his bank, Utah Construction, got a part in the Colorado River Dam project. Others in Eccles's community were also thinking and improvising, etc. So there was a real banking crisis. So much so that the banks effectively were sort of stalling their clients and trying to buy time so that people didn't grasp the reality that the banks could not, in a lot of cases, pay out the money that people had deposited in them. The money drought that America, I'm continuing with the same chapter, the money drought that America was suffering from had a technical name, deflation. Deflation meant that the currency was becoming more valuable every day, rarer and scarcer. Deflations can be good for lenders. The money they are owed in the future is more valuable than it was when they wrote the original contract to lend. But deflation is terrible for borrowers, whether they be countries, banks, businesses, or families. It means they must pay back more than they originally contracted to borrow. Inflation taxes savers. Deflation taxes risk takers and punishes leveragers. It makes paying mortgages as well as property taxes especially difficult. It goes against the American sense of promise, punishing those who dare to hope they might move ahead. Today, we know that the Treasury and the Federal Reserve might have done much to alleviate the deflation problem of the early 1930s. They could have allowed the gold standard mechanism to function. Money would have been created automatically with the gold inflows, or the Fed could have taken what we call counter-cyclical action. If the economy is strong, monetary authorities nowadays put on the brakes. If it is weak, they help out by greasing the wheels, pumping money into the economy in one way or the other. It's an understatement within the context of the past couple of years. That was what Fisher believed. He was now writing Hoover about money. But in the early 1930s, the Fed and its member banks lacked tools and knowledge. They did the opposite of counter-cyclical action. Now remember, this is when Hoover is still in power. They acted pro-cyclically, tightening and tightening in the face of a downturn. One of the reasons for the mistake was a rule known as the real bills doctrine. Under the doctrine, the young Fed system favored banks that carried substantial commercial paper, business loans of short term, 1 year or less, on their books. Commercial paper was regarded as the best form of hedge against the risk involved in demand deposits. Banks that carried such paper therefore were deemed prudent and worth saving. The more business they had, the more the Fed was ready to lend them. This was called serving, quote, the needs of the trade, unquote. Mortgages, which tended to have maturities of somewhat longer periods, won less approval from the banking system. This was mainly because their worth was harder to gauge. They were individual contracts and not traded as they are today. The effect of all this was that banks tended to make loans to businesses in periods of expansion. In periods of contraction, the banks made fewer loans. Yet those same bad periods were the very times when the banks most needed an infusion of cash from the Fed. Now, when they could have used help so much, the Fed denied them on the theory that they did not need the money. The newness of the Fed, it had only been created in 1913, was a big part of the problem, especially for small banks. Most of these were state-chartered banks that were not part of the first Federal Reserve System. These banks did not have much commercial paper in their portfolios. They served farms. Other banks did not regard them as especially worthy of rescue, and because they were not part of the Fed system, they were not the Fed's responsibility. So whereas other banks might have rescued them before, now everyone hesitated, and no one did. And when a bank died, money died with it, worsening the deflation. One casualty in the banking disaster was turning out to be Rex Tugwell's father. Tugwell was ultimately an advisor to Roosevelt when he was inaugurated. As Tugwell would write, quote, his business was paralyzed along with the rest. His chain of small banks discovered that investments of depositors' funds in railway and public utility bonds in Peruvian and other foreign issues could not be recovered. After twice replenishing capital out of their own pockets, the directors themselves were bankrupt. End quote. To Tugwell, it all seemed the confirmation of his suspicions and also, especially, of the perniciousness of the middleman taking his cut. Big business was wrong, too. Of his father and colleagues, he concluded, quote, they had done the honorable thing as small businessmen, but the big businessmen they had trusted had let them down, end quote. The bank's money problem played out everywhere. The market crash itself had not at first hurt Insull, whose brother Martin had completed some crucial financing of various Insull projects after the crash. But the deflation did, for the Insull empire was heavily leveraged. Now, Insull's long-standing philosophy of take on debt to grow as fast as you can, of leaning one's sail into the wind as far as it would go, was threatening to capsize his business. Insull was confident in his market. He believed that consumption of electricity would continue to grow even through a downturn. In the first half of 1931, cash was still pouring into his operating companies. But you could not keep buying up your own shares forever. New York banking houses finally had their chance for revenge against their old competitor. They vengefully drove down his shares. By the end of March 1931, Insull's creditors owned his bank portfolios. Banks had loans on their books, but their books did not reflect the families and businesses they turned down as money and credit became scarce. The worst hurt were the most hopeful, quote, farmers, small firms, end quote. For the wage earner, the lengthy deflation also had a peculiarly depressing effect. Since he was more likely to be a borrower than a lender, the deflation made it seem as though life were stacked against him. In inflation, wages rise. So that's Schlee's claim, though often, of course, followed by price rises. In deflation, that figure more important to the worker than any other, his wage does not move for years or even drops. In Harlan County, Kentucky, wages were below those of a decade prior. A wage cut of 10% by a desperate coal company in early 1931 sent workers into a fury. One killed a deputy sheriff, another a worker who chose not to strike. I've orders to shoot to kill, the Sheriff Johnson Henry Blair told Time. One of the miners' wives then wrote a bitter song. Quote, they say in Harlan County there are no neutrals there. End quote, wrote Florence Reese of the battle between the unions and the sheriff. Continuing, the Reese quote, "You'll either be a Union man or a thug for J.H. Blair," end quote. The title of the song, "Which Side Are You On?" captured not only the worker-employer division, but also the division that deflation was causing. By far the most dramatic place that the deflation played out was in American homes. In those days, home loans were not traded in bundles. It was hard for a bank to use them as collateral. Mortgages represented smaller shares of home values and carried shorter maturities, 5 or 10 years. Still, most mortgages had a contract with a bank or savings and loan that said if one couldn't pay, the bank got the house. It was as simple as that. And with the economy declining, house prices were also moving down, so some owners found themselves underwater. Their loan cost more than what the house was now worth. This experience, the experience of deflation, caused a chain reaction. A grim Senate witness would tell a subcommittee, "There will be this situation. There will be 3 mortgages in a block on all equally valued property. One mortgage may be for $3,000 on a house, another for $4,000, and another for $5,000 on houses that sold originally for $7,500, which are cut down in value now to $4,500. The holders of the mortgages buy the properties in. The man who holds the $3,000 mortgage on the first property wants to get his money. Someone comes along and says, 'I will give you $2,500 for it.' He replies, 'Make it $2,750, and the deal is closed on that basis. That fixes the value for the whole row." End of the statement. The money drought also meant that it was harder to borrow to cover one's losses. Worst of all, however, was that it slowed growth. In good times, the housing industry and the average family buoyed one another up. Now people were seeing the nightmare of the cycle in reverse. Home construction was down, hurting families. Families were down, hurting home construction. Home equity, for example, was one of the most important ways that members of the construction trade financed the opening of new businesses. Unable to borrow against their homes, they could not work. Quote, "Very often a witness testified of a would-be small businessman. He is absolutely prohibited from going into debt because the bank, speaking generally, will not give him any mortgage accommodation under any circumstances, not even at the 20% mortgage on his proposed home. That means, to my mind, a throttling of the building trades, the building industry, labor, and everything else that goes into the building game. They are strangling today," end quote. And what good could barter money do for the homeowner if the bank would not accept it for a mortgage? So you can see that the situation was really very dire. And second of all, that the thinking of the Fed, of economic planners, was the opposite of, or rather I should say quite different from what it is today. Nowadays, especially, and we saw this during the first few months of the coronavirus when it really started to hit the US, and the Fed started printing money to an almost jaw-dropping magnitude, printing trillions of new dollars in order to buoy up the economy, the stock market, really. So there's been a big shift in how economic crises are handled by the economic power elite. Are there other ways besides these 2 options? That's an issue worth discussing. In any case, during the 1930s, what happened was there was sort of a sink or swim attitude on the part of the economic authorities, and there was no sort of concept under the Hoover administration of printing more money in order to create some inflation and in order to have a situation in which people started borrowing again to start new business ventures, and in that way buoy up the economy. So the economy was stagnant, it was frozen. And that's what Roosevelt was trying to change when he was elected.